This is Steve Young for the Caux Roundtable. A little while ago, my president, Donald Trump, addressed the United Nations. American presidents have been doing this, I think, year in and year out for a long time. And I've listened to some of them, and my eyes glaze over sometime, but there's a sort of a dignity and a formal process where the American president recognizes the importance for all humanity of the Charter of the United Nations, and people, even they may disagree with each other, coming together to peacefully solve disputes. Well, Donald Trump doesn't have much confidence or a very high opinion of the United Nations. He's talking about how he's been solving wars. He's sort of helped broker the peace agreements, ceasefire agreements, things like that, in 7 conflict situations. And then he said that, quote, "It's too bad that I had to do these things instead of the United Nations doing them. All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped in the middle. If the First Lady wasn't in great shape, she would have fallen, but she's in great shape. Later, I realized that the United Nations wasn't there for us. They weren't there. I thought of it really after the fact, not during these negotiations, which were not easy. That being the case, what is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN is such tremendous potential. I've always said it. It has such tremendous, tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. For the most part, at least for now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war." Then he goes on to say, at minute 24, because his entire speech is 55 minutes, not only is the UN not solving the problems it should, too often, it's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the #1 political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. Your countries are being ruined. And then he goes on to take on the European nations as being sad cases of failure on permitting excessive migration and going for green energy. Well, I think we need to look at President Trump's speech as a marker of something that's not very good, because he's not all wrong about the current status of the United Nations. I would argue it isn't doing very much. It isn't very strong. People don't sort of, invite the UN in to solve problems. The wars, they're not doing anything with Ukraine or in Gaza with Israel. Of course, they have to wait for, bodies to come together, this council, that council, the General Assembly. The United Nations does not have leaders who sort of are invited and respected to give talks and things. So we have a problem. I would say the problem is, and other people are starting to talk about this, we're in a transition period between 2 eras. One era, whatever we want to call it, the post-World War II era, was an era that had the United Nations and its values at the center. The values of peace, negotiations, the rule of law, human rights, standards to which we could hold our governments accountable. Now, of course, there was the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc, which didn't get along with these, didn't accept these ideas. There was a war in Korea. There was a war in Vietnam. There were the Soviet satellite countries in Eastern Europe. That all collapsed, however, 1989. And there was a thought in the early 90s that we can run a world based on what? On some vision of justice, of law, of respect for other people, of human rights, of freedom to do what we want with ourselves, with our families, things like that. But now we have a war in Ukraine. 100,000 Russians killed and wounded. I don't know how many thousand Ukrainians. We have ongoing conflict in Gaza. Civilians have died as a consequence of Israeli bombing. We have conflicts in Africa. We have wars in I think, South Sudan, in the Sudan itself. And we're now having, again, thanks to my president, trade conflicts over tariffs. How much money how much can I squeeze your economy? And how much can you squeeze my economy? There are great issues about what do we do about global warming. So where does one turn? If the architecture was erected after World War II is now, what should we say, with a leaky roof, broken windows, holes in the floor, what do we do? Well, I would suggest that, quite frankly, in a very immodest way, that the idea behind the Caux Roundtable is a good one and could point to helping the new era, this post-World War II era, or post-World War II era move. And what is that? That's the concept of principles. I mean, what are principles? Principles they're abstract. They don't depend on a government. They're not enforced. They're not law. On the other hand, they're not driven by power. They tend more to be ideals. They tend more to be goal-oriented. They focus on behaviors. They're kind of a thou should, thou shalt, sort of an idea. And they set standards, like the Caux Roundtable ethical principles for business, for moral capitalism. If you're running a business, be nice, pay attention, be reasonable to your stakeholders. It's not all about you're just grabbing the money from them. That's rent extraction. Rent extraction is a practice, it's not a principle. So my thought is we should really think more. And then if we think about it, how do we teach this? How do we teach principles? And then you come to the tough one. My principles might be different from your principles. So how do you and I get along? Let's say I'm Muslim. Let's say you're Roman Catholic. Let's say you're Soviet Orthodox. Let's say you have an indigenous belief, either in the Xenacantecan Maya, where I lived for a summer, sort of a Mayan kind of Spanish Catholicism. It wasn't my religion. My religion wasn't their religion. Some people are atheists. So what do we do with if we have different principles? The question then, it seems to me, based on the Caux Round experience, is we can talk to each other about the internal dynamics, the expectations of our principles. And what you find in many, many cases is that there's actually agreement at some higher level, a more simple, vague level of what the good is. Being healthy for most people is a good. Now, I may use this kind of medicine, you use that kind of medicine. So an effort for dialogue, an effort for discussion. I read your text, I read your scripture, you read my scripture. And I would predict that in there's going to be some overlap at some level. It could even be, I know some of you may know that the golden rule, which I grew up as a New England Unitarian in the Christian tradition, is Jesus Christ. Well, apparently there's an equivalent in literal words to the golden rule in, 37 different religious traditions. Paul Pullman's wife has sort of a project about this to get us to focus on the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.